Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. If you like what you hear, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And now, on with our story time. Gyda's saucy message. Now, Harold heard men talk of Gyda, the daughter of King Eric. She is very beautiful, they said, but she is very proud, too. She can both read and make runes. No other woman in the world knows so much about herbs as she does. She can cure any sickness, and she is proud of all this. Now, when King Harold heard that, he thought to himself, fair and proud, I like them both. I will have her for my wife. So he called his uncle Guthorm and said, take rich gifts and go to Gyda's foster father and tell him I will marry her. So Guthorm and his men came to that house, and they told the king's message to the foster father. Gyda was standing near, wearing a rich cloak. She heard the speech. She came up and said, holding her head high and curling her lip, I will not waste myself on a king of so few people. Norway is a strange country. There is a little king here and a little king there, hundreds of them scattered about. Now in Denmark, there is but one great king over the whole land, and it is so in Sweden. Is no one brave enough to make all of Norway his own? She laughed a scornful laugh and walked away. The men stood with open mouths and stared after her. Could it be that she had sent that saucy message to King Harold? They looked at her foster father. He was chuckling in his beard and said nothing to them. They started out of the house in anger. When they were at the door, Gyda came up to them again and said, give this message to your King Harold for me. I will not be his wife unless he puts all of Norway under him, for my sake. So Guthorm and his men rode homeward across the country. They did not talk. They were all thinking. At last one said, how shall we give this message to the king? I have been thinking of that, Guthorm said. His anger is no little thing. It was late when they rode into the king's yard, for they had ridden slowly, trying to make some plan for softening the message, but they had thought of none. I see light through the wind's eyes of the feast hall, one said. Yes, the king keeps feast, Guthorm said. We must give our message before all of his guests. So they went in with very heavy hearts. There sat King Harold in the high seats. The benches on both sides were full of men. The tables had been taken out, and the mead horns were going round. Oh ho, cried King Harold, our messengers. What news? Then Guthorm said, Miss Gyda is a bold and saucy girl, King Harold. My tongue refuses to give her message. The king stamped his foot. Out with it, he cried. What does she say? She says she will not marry so little a king, Guthorm answered. Harold jumped to his feet. His face flushed red. Guthorm stretched out his hand. They are not my words, O king. They are the words of a silly girl. Is there any more? The king asked. Go on. She said, there is one king in Denmark and one king in Sweden. Is there no man brave enough to make himself king of all Norway? Tell King Harold that I will not marry him unless he puts all of Norway under him for my sake. The guests sat speechless, staring at Guthorm. All at once the king broke into a roar of laughter. "By the hammer of Thor," he cried, "that is a good message. I thank you, Gyda. Did you hear it, friends? King of all Norway. Why, we are all stupids. Why did we not think of that?" Then he raised his horn high. "Now hear my vow. I say, I will not cut my hair or comb it until I am king of all Norway. That I will be, or I will die." Then he drank off the horn of mead, and while he drank it, all the men in the hall stood up and waved their swords and shouted and shouted. That old hall, in all its 200 years of feasts, had not heard such a noise before. "Ah, Harold," Guthorm cried. Surely Thor in Valhalla smiled when he heard that vow. The men sat all night talking of that wonderful vow. On the very next day, King Harold sent out his war arrows. Soon a great army was gathered. They marched through the country north and south, east and west, burning houses and fighting battles as they went. People fled before them, some to their own kings, some inland to the deep woods and hid there. But some went to King Harold and said, "We will be your men." "Then take the oath, and I will be friends with you," he said. The men took off their swords and laid them down, and came one by one and knelt before the king. They put their hands between his knees and said, "From this day, Harold Halfdanson, I am your man. I will serve you in war. For my land, I will pay you taxes. I will be faithful to you as my king." Then Harold said, "I am your king, and I will be faithful to you." Many kings took that oath, and thousands of common men. Of all the battles that Harold fought, he did not lose one. Now, for a long time the king's hair and beard had not been combed or cut. They stood out around his head in a great bushy mat of yellow. At a feast one day, when the jokes were going round, Harold's uncle said, "Harold, I will give you a new name. After this, you shall be called Harold Shockhead. As my naming gift, I give you this drinking horn." "It is a good name," laughed all the men. After that, all the people called him Harold Shockhead. During these wars, whenever King Harold got a country for his own, this is what he did. He said, "All the marshland and the woodland where no people live is mine. For his farm, every man shall pay me taxes." Over every country he put some brave, wise man and called him Earl. He said to the earls, "You shall collect the taxes and pay them to me. But some of you shall keep for yourselves. You shall punish any man who steals or murders or does any wicked thing. When your people are in trouble, they shall come to you, and you shall set the thing right. You must keep peace in the land. I will not have my people troubled with robber Vikings." The earls did all these things as best they could, for they were good, strong men. The farmers were happy, they said. "We can work on our farms with peace now." Before King Harold came, something was always wrong. The Vikings would come and steal our gold and our grain and burn our houses, or the king would call us to war. Those little kings are always fighting. It is better under King Harold. But the chiefs, who liked to fight and go a Viking, hated King Harold and his new ways. One of these chiefs was Solfi. He was a king's son. Harold had killed his father in battle. Solfi had been in that battle. At the end of it, he had fled away with 200 men and got into ships. "We will make that shockhead smart," he said. So they harried the coast of King Harold's country. They filled their ships with gold. They ate other men's meals. They burned farmhouses behind them. The people cried out to the earls for help. So the earls had out their ships all the time trying to catch Solfi. But he was too clever for them. In the spring, he went to a certain king, Audiobook, and said to him, "Now, there are two things that we can do. We can become this shockhead Harold's thralls. We can kneel before him and put our heads between his knees, or else we can fight. My father thought it better to die in battle than to be any man's thrall. How is it? Will you join with my cousin Arnvid and me against this young shockhead?" "Yes, I will do it," said the king. The Sea Fight. Many felt as Solfi did. So when King Oddbjorn and King Arnvid sent out their war arrows, a great host gathered. All men came by sea. 200 ships lay at anchor in the fjord, looking like strange swimming animals because of their high carved prows and bright paint. There were red and gold dragons with long necks and curved tails. Seahorses reared out of the water. Green and gold snakes coiled up. Seahawks sat with spread wings ready to fly. And among all these curved necks stood up the tall, straight masts with the long yard arms swinging across them, holding up the looped-up sails. When the starting horn blew and their sails were let down, it was like the spreading of hundreds of curious flags. Some were striped black and yellow or blue and gold. Some were white with a raven or a brown bear embroidered on them, or blue with a white seahawk, or black with a gold sun. Some were edged with fur. As the wind filled the gaudy sails, the ships moved off. The men waved their hands to the women on shore and sang, "To the sea, to the sea." The wind in our sail, the sea in our face, and the smell of the fight. After ship meets ship, in the quarrel of swords, King Harold shall lie in the caves under sea, and Norsemen shall laugh. In the prow stood men leaning forward and sniffing the air with joy. Some were talking of King Harold. Yesterday, he had a hard fight, they said. Today, he'll be lying still, dressing his wounds and mending his ships. We shall take him by surprise. They sailed near the coast. Solfi and his Seahawk was already ahead and leading the way. Suddenly, men saw his snail veer and his oars flash out. He had quickly turned his boat and was rowing back. He came close to King Arnvid and called, "He is there ahead. His boats are ready in line of battle. The fox has not been asleep." King Arnvid blew his horn. Slowly his boots came into line with the sea stag. Again he blew the horn. Cables were thrown across from one prow to the next, and all the ships were tied together so that their sides touched. Then the men set their sails again, and they went past a tongue of land in a broad fjord. There lay the long line of King Harold's ships, with their fierce heads grinning and mocking the newcomers. Back of those prows was what looked like a long wall. with spots of green and red and blue and yellow and shining gold. It was the locked shields of the men in the bows, and over every shield looked fierce blue eyes. Higher up and farther back was another wall of shields, for on the half-deck in the stern of every ship stood the captain with his shield guard of 12 men. Arnvid's people had furled their sails and were taking down the masts, but the ships were still drifting on with the wind. The horn blew, and quickly every man sprang to his place in bow and stern. All were leaning forward with clenched teeth and widespread nostrils. They were clutching their naked swords in their hands. Their flashing eyes looked over at their shields. Soon, King Arnvid's ships crashed into Harold's line, and immediately the men in the bows began to swing their swords at one another. The soldiers of the shield guard on the high decks began to throw darts and stones and to shoot arrows into the ships opposite them. So in every ship, showers of stones and arrows were falling, and many men died under them or got broken arms or legs. Spears were hurled from deck to deck, and many of them bit deep into the men's bodies. In every bow, men slashed with their swords at their foes in the opposite ship. Some jumped upon the gunwale to get nearer, or hung from the prowhead. Some even leaped into the enemy's boat. King Harold's ship lay prow to prow with King Arnvid's. Battle had been going on for an hour. King Harold was still in the stern on the deck. There was a dent in his helmet. The great stone had struck. There was a gash in his shoulder where a spear had cut. But he was still fighting and laughed as he worked. Wolf meets wolf today, he said. But things are going very badly in the prow. Ivar fallen, Thorstein wounded, 12 men lying in the bottom of the boat. He leaped down from the deck and ran along the gunwale, shouting as he went, "Harold and victory." So he came to the bow and stood swinging his sword as fast as he breathed. Every time it hit a man of Arnvid's men, Harold's own warriors cheered, seeing him. "Harold and victory," they shouted, and went to work again with good heart. Slowly, King Arnvid's men fell back before Harold's biting sword. Then Harold's men threw a great hook into that boat and pulled it alongside and still pushed King Arnvid's people back. "Come on, follow me," cried Harold. Then he leaped into King Arnvid's boat, and his warriors followed him. "He comes like a mad wolf," King Arnvid's men said, and they turned and ran back below the deck. Then Arnvid himself leapt down and stood with his sword raised. "Can this young shockhead make cowards of you all?" he cried. But Harold's sword struck him, and he fell dead. Then a big, bloody Viking of King Arnvid leaped upon the edge of the ship and stood there. He held his drinking horn and his sword high in his hands. "Ran, and not you, shockhead, shall have them and me," he cried, and leapt, laughing into the water, but was drowned. Many other warriors chose the same death on that terrible day. All along the line of boats, men fought for hours. In some places the cables had been cut, and the boats had drifted apart. Ships lay scattered about, 2 by 2, fighting. Many boats sank. Many men died. Some fled away in their ships. And at the end, King Harold had won the battle. So he had King Arnvid's country and King Oddbjorn's country. Many men took the oath and became his friends. All people were talking of his wonderful battles. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams.